Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today. My name is Alex McCutcheon from UNICOM. We're delighted to be hosting today's presentation, which is on the theme of 2 success factors in test automation. Our presenter today, I'm delighted to announce, is Dorothy Graham. Dorothy's worked with UNICOM for many, many years, I think close on 30 years now, and for many people she possibly needs no introduction. Dorothy is the author of several books in the field of software testing, software inspection. She was also part of the original team that started testing qualifications and certifications in the UK, which sort of morphed into the ISTQB syllabus, foundation syllabus. After 19 years running her own consulting company in testing, Grove Consultants, Dorothy now focuses on keynote speaking and training and participating in events, and also quite an amount of writing. You're in for a treat today. Dorothy is an absolutely fantastic speaker, and I should also just mention that she will be coming to London. She's presenting on the 26th of June, a workshop on the same theme actually as today's webinar, Managing Successful Test Automation. And she's also one of our speakers at the Next Generation Testing Conference the previous day on 25th of June. There is information, by the way, about those events on the UNICOM website, which is unicom.co.uk. And at the end of today's presentation, there will be opportunity for some Q&A, so please feel free to type in your questions, and Dorothy will endeavour to answer as many as possible in the time. So Dorothy, thank you again, and without further ado, I will hand over.
Thanks very much, Alec. Thank you very much for inviting me to present the webinar. As you say, I've been working with UNICOM for about 30 years and have always enjoyed working with you. In fact, the very first publication that I did on listing testing tools was called the CAST report, and that was published by UNICOM. So we go back a long way. Today, I'm going to talk about 2 success factors in test automation. Of course, there are a lot more than 2, but today I'm only going to cover 2. And test automation, maybe we should start first of all by saying, what do I mean by test automation? And I'm talking about test automation in the sense that most people use the term functional system level test automation, not test-driven development or unit level automation. So the success factors I'm going to talk about today, by the way, there are success factors that are related both to management issues and also to technical issues, and both are important because you can fail at automation for either reasons. In terms of the management issues, the one I'm going to talk about today is having good goals or objectives for your test automation. If you don't have the right sort of goals, you may well get unrealistic expectations, and the automation will fail because it's not properly supported, because people didn't realize what was involved. And having good objectives is critical to success. Other objectives, other things in management that are important for automation include things like return on investment, automation and agile, who does what, resourcing or staffing, but we won't have time to talk about those today. On the technical side, I'm going to talk about the most important technical issue, which is the testware architecture. If you don't have a good architecture for your automated testware, you may end up with high maintenance cost. And in fact, if you are suffering at the moment from high maintenance costs of your automation, it's quite likely that your testware architecture needs attention. And of course, there are other technical factors like scripting techniques, data-driven, keyword-driven, a test status more than pass-fail, organizing testware for reuse, and so on, which again, we won't have time to cover today, but we will be covering in the workshop on the 26th of June. So test automation objectives then. Here are some objectives. Are these good ones for automation? I've seen these as people say, this is what we want to do with our automation. And they look pretty good on the surface, but are they really good objectives? Find lots of bugs. Well, actually, automated tests may not find lots of bugs. And I'm going to talk about that one in particular because that's a fairly important one. Let's automate our manual tests, or more often people will say, let's automate all of our manual tests. Well, that can be a good starting point, but it's actually not necessarily the best thing to do. Reduce testing time. Well, that's a popular one, isn't it? Now, in fact, that one, again, isn't necessarily the best objective to have, because what part of testing are we talking about? What the test execution tools do is reduce test execution time and comparison time, but testing is a lot more than just executing tests. How about this one? Run tests that are tedious and error-prone if we run them manually. Actually, this is an excellent objective for test automation, because the tools will run the tests consistently and in the same way every time, and if it's something that people typically make a lot of mistakes with when they run them manually, then using a tool to run them is an excellent thing to do. How about let's run regression tests evenings and weekends? Well, yes, this can be a useful thing to do, but as an objective, it's got a problem. Let me tell you a story. There was one guy who decided he wanted to make a really good impression with his boss. And so he got 10 tests that had all passed, automated tests this is, and he found a room with 12 PCs in it, and he started these 10 tests running, just looping around, running over and over again on all 12 PCs. And of course they all started at slightly different times, so they were all, it looked really great, all these PCs running tests. And he called his boss over and he said, "Look, boss, these tests are going to run all weekend." Yeah, of course they will. They're not doing a lot, are they? Unfortunately, his boss was very impressed. So just the fact that you're running them evenings and weekends is not really a good objective, although it can be a useful byproduct of using machines that are sitting around idle. It's only worth doing if the tests that you are running are actually worthwhile running. And if they are worthwhile running, and if there isn't time to run them during normal working hours, then of course this is a good idea, but it's not a good objective for automation. Let's go back to this idea about finding bugs. Looking at two types of testing, regression testing and exploratory testing, what type of testing finds the most bugs? This is not a trick question, by the way. Of course, exploratory testing is what finds lots of bugs. If you do exploratory testing, you're running tests that have never been run before, so you're exploring bits of the software that other tests have not reached. And this is, if you want to find lots of bugs, exploratory testing is very effective. What do people most often automate? It's regression testing. Regression testing, by definition, is running tests that have run before, and when they ran before, they passed. So if nothing has changed in that particular area, this test is going to pass again. So it's very unlikely to find a bug. And if you automate that test, it's even less likely to find a bug because it's being run more often. So trying to find lots of bugs by automating regression testing is actually not the right thing to do. And the reason for this is it's not automation that finds bugs. It's actually tests that find bugs, not automation. Automation is a mechanism for running tests. Any given test, any single test, if that test is able to find a bug, and if that bug is present, then running that test manually will find it, and running that test using a tool will find it. Well, there may be exceptions, but in general, the bug-finding ability of a single test is not affected by the manner in which it is executed, manual or using a tool. So find lots of bugs can be a dangerous objective, especially if you're automating regression testing. In the book Experiences of Test Automation, one of the people in that wrote in the chapter that they wrote, Ed Allen and Brian Newman, they actually analyzed the percentage of bugs that were found by the different types of testing. This was over 3 releases, 5 million lines of code project, around 2,000 bugs they were looking at. And they found, they divided the number of, the percentage of bugs found by the automated tests, manual scripted tests, exploratory tests, and fixed verification tests. So if you were going to put some percentages in here, would you think it's evenly distributed with 25% each? No, of course not. I can't fool you on that one. I'll give you a hint that the fixed verification is 8.4%. So that's like 10%, so 30% each for the rest. Not far off with the manual scripted testing, that was actually 24%. And of the other two, what do you think? Of course, exploratory testing found nearly 60% of the bugs, and the manual tests found less than 10% of the bugs in this set of bugs that they had for these 3 releases. Now, at one of the testing conferences in the States, one day I sat down next to a guy and got chatting. It turned out he was quite a high-level manager And so I asked him if they were doing automation. And he said, well, the guys tell me that they've got some automated regression tests automated, and they've got a lot of them done, I think, and they're running them evenings and weekends, and they seem to be sort of doing a lot with these automated tests. But I'm thinking of canceling it, knocking it on the head. Why? It sounds as though you've got tests running. They seem to be able to maintain the tests fairly well. Well, they're not finding many bugs. We had a sort of full and frank discussion at that point. I mean, if he had, perhaps he had statistics in his company that looked similar to this, and he looked at automated tests, only finding 10% of the bugs. That's not very effective, is it? But no, it's not effective at finding bugs. It's because it's running tests that are not intended to find bugs. They're running tests that are intended to give you confidence that things haven't gone backwards. But one of the things is, if the automated tests are then removed from this equation, would you still find this many tests with exploratory testing? Well, no, you wouldn't. Because if the people now have to do the regression testing manually, they're not going to have time to do exploratory testing. So taking away the automated tests does not give you more bug finding ability, it gives you less. Another popular objective is, let's automate X% of the tests. And this is usually 100%. Let's automate all of our manual tests. So let's look at that as a test automation objective. Here are our manual tests, and here are our automated tests. And we have some manual tests that we've automated so far. It looks like about 50% on the diagram, but this is just hypothetical. So we have some tests over here that are not automated yet. Should we be aiming to move the circle so that all of the manual tests are automated? A lot of people think that's what you're supposed to do, but that's not true. You should not automate all of your manual tests. There are tests in this space that are better run as manual tests, including maybe some that you've automated already. What sort of examples do we have here? Well, you know, when you go on a website and you have this CAPTCHA, where you have to type in the wavy letters and so on, the purpose of that is to prove that you're a human being and not a computer. So if your automation could actually do that, it means your software is broken, right? Now, of course, I know there are ways to test it automatically, but what about things like, do these colors look nice? Or is this exactly the way a typical business user would approach the software and use it? You can't tell that unless you are looking at what a real human being is doing. And one human being might do something different to another one. Another thing which isn't a good idea to automate, supposing you have a test that's quite difficult to automate and takes a long time. Simon Mills, who's written one of the other chapters in both of our automation books, actually, tells a story of a guy who was really keen on automation. He had this test, he was determined to automate it. He spent a day. Well, it wasn't quite finished yet. He spent another day, and another. He spent a week. He ended up spending 2 weeks, 10 days, and it still wasn't quite perfect, trying to automate one test. This test, by the way, would have taken half an hour to run manually and was only needed once a quarter. That's not a good idea to automate. It's not worth it. So there are definitely tests which should not be automated in your set of manual tests. But again, another problem with this as an objective for automation is that people think that we are only automating our manual tests. And if you think only of the manual tests you have now and automate them, you're missing a lot of the real power of automation. Because there are things on this side, tests and particularly verification, that are not possible or not practical to do manually. For example, if you're sitting and looking at a screen, you can see whether things look okay, but you don't know whether all your GUI objects are in the right state. Things like that can be checked quite easily with automation, but not easy to do manually. There are also other types of testing that you can do automatically with using the tools which are not practical to do manually. Some of the new approaches using lots of random inputs, for example, like monkey testing. And if you restrict your automation to only your manual tests, you're not using the power of automation. One more popular objective for test automation. Let's reduce our testing time. Sounds good, right? Now, if we look at, by the way, the thing which normally makes testing take a long time is nothing to do with the automation. What makes testing take a long time is the fact that you find bugs, and then the bugs have to be fixed, and then they have to be tested again. That's why it takes a long time. But even looking at just the testing itself, we may have some, if we're doing testing manually, we might have some editing of the tests and some setup. Then test execution takes a long time, shown in the light blue in the diagram. Analyzing failures and clearing up afterwards also might take a long time. If we look at test execution tools, we say, oh, look at that. When all those tests are automated, we can reduce our test execution time by lots. Yeah, looks great, doesn't it? But what about all the other testing activities? Maintenance of the tests may take a lot longer than maintenance of the manual tests. Setup and clear up activities may take longer. Analyzing the failures may take significantly longer. This is something, by the way, which is often overlooked in test automation. If you're testing manually and you've just done a test, you've sort of been going through various stuff and say, yeah, that works okay, yeah, that's okay. Oh, look, something's wrong here. I've got a bug to report. At that point in time, in your head, you know exactly what you just did. You have the context of that bug in your head. So you know what went on before, you know what you were testing, you know what things passed, and you are able to report what this bug was because you know what it is. When that test gets automated, and when it fails, what happens? Ping, you get an email. Test 37 failed. Oh, okay, what was test 37? What was it testing? What did it do? What was it? What's happened before? You don't have the context of that bug. In order to investigate the bug, and of course any automated fail has to be investigated, you need to first of all construct the context for that bug. Now, depending on what you've got included in the automation, you may have some help for that with the automation, but it has to be built in. And that, of course, takes time in the design of the automation. That's part of the testware architecture. Now, ideally, of course, we want to have all of the activities associated with automation taking less time, and then indeed we can do testing in less time when our automation is more mature. So reducing testing time is maybe a good long-term goal for test execution, but it may actually not be something that's achievable in the short term. Now, the main difference between testing and automation is the difference between efficiency and effectiveness. If we have some testing which is slow because it's manual, if we automated that, it would be fast, and that would be good, right? Sounds good. Now, the problem is that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is how effective is your testing. You might well have poor quality slow testing, and if you automate that, you'll have poor quality fast testing. I think it was the original CAST report where I put the phrase that if your testing is chaos, automating that just gives you faster chaos. Well, it's more important to know that our testing is good testing, that we're getting value from the testing that we're doing. So people often will start with poor quality tests that are manual, and often will move straight over to automating those poor quality tests. So that's not a good place to go. You will get much more value from looking at the quality of the testing that you're doing and paying attention to that and having better testing. Then once you have better testing, then automate not everything, but only what's useful and will give value from the better quality tests. That's where you get the greatest benefit from automation. So good objectives for test automation should be realistic, first of all, something that can be achieved, not something which is not achievable. We want to have both short-term and long-term objectives for automation. And the objectives that you have now aren't necessarily the objectives that you will want to have, say, a year from now or 2 years from now. So it's important to regularly go back to your objectives and see if they are giving you the value that you need. And don't be afraid to revise them or to throw some out and put some new ones in. The objectives for test automation should be measurable so that you can tell whether you've achieved it or not. By the way, you may have measures both for the progress of implementing the automation, but there should also be measures for the health of the automation itself. And again, that's something we'll be covering on the workshop. And it's very important that the objectives for automation are different to the objectives for testing. Finding lots of bugs is a great objective for testing. It's one of the most important objectives there is for testing. But it's not a good objective for automation because automation doesn't find bugs. Automation only runs tests. Testing tools don't do testing, by the way. Testing tools just run stuff. So the execution tools are doing what they're told. They're programming. They're programs. So automation is there to support the testing activities and to support the testers. Well, one other thing I want to tell you about at this point, a lady called Saretta Gamba, who is one of the contributors to our Testing Experiences book, when she saw all the other chapters, she, as a developer, she said, patterns. And so we've been working together on Test Automation Patterns, which is a wiki. Here's the website, testautomationpatterns.wikispaces.com. And we have patterns for various things within test automation. And the one that's relevant here is one that we've called Set Clear Goals. And each pattern references other patterns, and there are ways to get into the patterns through issues, which are problems. So this is something that's free for anybody. We're doing this as a public service, and we'd be interested in people who look at the patterns wiki, giving us any feedback. Now, of course, this was just one of the aspects of one of the management issues in terms of test automation is having good objectives. Other management concerns include resourcing and staffing, who should actually do what in automation, automation in Agile, having a pilot project, not just when you start automation, but for changes to it, measuring progress and health, return on investment, dealing with high-level managers, dealing with developers, what should be automated and what shouldn't, and what can be lost in automation. So all of these things are things that we'll be covering when we have more time. So that's the management one. And the testware architecture is the critical technical factor that I want to talk about. And if you are suffering at the moment from having high maintenance costs for your automation, it's likely that your testware architecture is one of the root causes for that. So what do we mean by testware architecture? Well, if we have our testers up here and we have our test execution tool down here, which runs scripts, we could say anything in between is actually our testware architecture. And if you do nothing at all, but just say, here you are, testers, here's a tool, get on with it, then effectively you said, this is our testware architecture. There's nothing there. Now, it's very important for success in test automation that you have structured testware. This is the essence of your testware architecture. A framework is an implementation of a testware architecture. And the test automator or a testware architect would be the role of the person who is going to design the testware. Years ago, before we sort of realized that software needed to be designed, people wrote spaghetti code. I've done it myself many, many years ago. Nowadays, if you give testers who don't have a programming background a tool with a scripting language, they will write spaghetti tests because they don't know about how to write good software. And the structured testware, there are two layers of abstraction here which are critical for success. And having structured scripts is the most important from the technical point of view. The scripting languages are programming languages, so you need to apply good programming practices to the scripts. You don't want to have one script per test, for example. Your scripts need to be modular. They need to be reused, not just reusable, but able to be found so they can be reused. They need to be robust so that they don't fall down at the first thing that happens that might disturb them, like an email message coming in. If you have this layer of abstraction here, where you have structured scripts, you would have, for example, certain scripts which are specific to the tool that you're using now, but keep those to a minimum. Make sure that you have the tests are in scripts that are not tool specific and are reusable. If you're going to be investing a lot of time in building up the automated tests, you want to make sure that that investment will be used for a long time to come. You don't want to have to throw it all away when you have to change to another tool, for example. So if you have a good layer of abstraction here, your testware will be easier to maintain. If the software changes in one particular aspect, you should only have 1 or 2 scripts that need to be updated, not hundreds. And you may be perfectly happy with the tool that you have now, but who's to say that that's going to be the ideal tool for you in, say, 5 years' time or 10 years' time? So you may well have to change tools as well. And the more tool-specific your scripts are, the more problems you're going to have with that. So this is the way to get a long life out of your automation. The other level of abstraction is at the level of high-level keywords or a domain-specific test language. Depending on who you have to actually use the automation, if you want people who are business users, people who are come from the business side, who are not technical, who are not programmers, if you want them to be able to write up what they want to have in a test, write the content of a test, and have that test be run by the tool, this is the structure you need to put in place here is this other level of abstraction. If you do this, you can have business users writing the tests and running them without having to know anything about any of the detail, the technical detail about the tool. Of course, this needs a lot of support from technical people. But if you have this abstraction layer, it means it's easier to write automated tests, and the automation will be more widely used, and you will therefore get more benefit from the automation. So the testware architecture is a critical factor. If you don't do anything about this, by the way, and we have a pattern for testware architecture as well. The easy way out is just to use the tools architecture, because each tool has its own way of organizing tests, and it will say, here's how you organize your tests. And if you don't know any better, you'll say, oh, okay then. But that's for the convenience of the tool. And it will lock you into that tool. And if you bought the tool from a vendor, they will be very pleased. But even with an open source tool, if you are locked into that tool too closely, you will lose the benefit of being able to make your automation more flexible. A better way, which gives you an independence from any tool, organize your tests to suit you and keep the tool-specific test scripts to a minimum. Make sure your tests are reusable. If you do have to copy something somewhere where a tool needs to find it, that's part of pre-processing. And in post-processing, you copy it back to where you want it to be. Now, pre- and post-processing is another aspect of the testware architecture, and I just want to touch on that briefly before we finish the webinar. Let me tell you a story about the dishwasher that we have in our church. We redid the kitchen, and we bought secondhand, admittedly, this dishwasher. Now, a dishwasher is an automated process, right? So you think, right, that will automate the washing of the cups. Well, yes, it does. But before we can start, you have to turn it on at least half an hour before. So that's a manual process. You have to make sure that the plug is in very securely, and that's definitely a manual process, which is tricky to do. But then it will wash the cups in about 2 minutes, so that's great. And then when we're finished, you think, well, that's it. We just say done now and walk away. But no, in order to empty the water out, someone has to stand there and hold the button in until the water gets emptied out. Another manual process. So yes, it's sort of a bit of automation surrounded by manual processes. You might think, what's this got to do with test automation? Well, if you may well have automated tests, but you may not have automated testing. And all the other things that are around the execution is what makes it into automated testing rather than tests. So we select and identify the test cases to run, set up our test environment, and then for each test case, set up the prerequisites. Okay, that's all been manual so far. Now we've got our automation executing and comparing results. Okay, then we're going to look at the logs, analyze the failures, report defects, do a few more tests, and then clear up the test environment, summarize results. Yes, we've got some automation, but we only have automated tests. What we really want to have are automate as much as possible around the automation. Automation is more than automation. So we want to have automated processes for as much as we can possibly do. We still need to decide which test cases to run, analyze the failures, and report defects. But anything else that can be automated should be automated if you want to get the benefits out of automation. So that's another aspect of a technical aspect of the test automation. And there are others, of course, quite a few. Where should we organize the testware? It's important to put the test results in a different place to the test materials, for example. The key issues of scale with shared materials and multiple versions, pre and post processing, which I touched on, the test status, more than just pass and fail in automation, can be very useful. The different types of scripting techniques, documenting tests, and comparison techniques with using filters and test sensitivity. So there's a lot to talk about with test automation. And a lot of these things, you may have noticed, have nothing to do with any specific tool. They're all generic, whichever type of test execution tool you are using. Okay, well, this is the two success factors that I wanted to talk to you about. And it's now time for questions. And while you're thinking of a question that you might want to ask, I will just have a little commercial break here with a shameless commercial plug. These are the 4 books that I've co-authored. Software Inspection with Tom Gill, that was published in '93. The Software Test Automation book was published more than 10 years ago by Mark Fuster and myself. And part 1 of that book was How to Do Automation, and is still relevant today, although we hope to update it at some point. I also did the Foundations book with Rex Black, Eric van Veenendaal, and the earlier editions with Isabel Evans. And the Test Automation Experiences book came out of the earlier book. The second half of that was case studies, and this turned into a book in its own right. That was published in 2012. And I know I'm totally biased, but I think it's absolutely a brilliant book. It's just case studies, and we've drawn the lessons out from it, summarized them at a chapter at the beginning, and so on. Oh, and by the way, the publisher is offering a special deal. This is just on the e-book of the Experiences book. You can get a 35% discount if you put in that code. So that's useful to know, not on the printed book, but just on the e-book. And here's another reminder about the wiki, the test automation patterns. And that's my website and my email address. So do we have any questions from the audience at the moment? We have one. What sort of measures can we set for the health of automation? Okay, yes, these are ongoing measures. Thank you very much, Email, for that question. Yes, you're quite right. When you're starting automation, often what you're going to be doing is looking at the measures for, how many tests have we automated, how long does it take to automate a given test, and so on. In terms of the test automation health, we're looking at what's happening in an ongoing way. In other words, is the maintenance cost for a set of tests, is that coming down sort of month by month for a set of automated tests? The build cost, is that coming down month by month? The failure analysis cost, what is it in terms of the ongoing automation that we can address, that we can actually make the automation become more and more efficient? So it's really ways of measuring the increased efficiency for the automation. I hope that gives you some idea of that. Again, we'll go in more depth on the, I hope you can come on the tutorial, that would be the workshop, that would be good. We have another question here. What's the role of developers in helping with testing architecture, as they probably have an idea of possible weak areas with their design? Thank you, Louis, that's a good question. The role of developers, one of the interesting things when we were doing the Experiences book is that one of the critical factors that came up with the people who were the most successful in the experiences we looked at were those that had a very good relationship with their developers. So certainly if you are thinking of what programming language should we use to develop our automation in, use the same languages that the developers are using at the moment. That means that you will be able to get advice and support from them and also understand their problems. Some people say the developers are the people who should develop the test architecture, and they certainly have something to say to it because they do understand good design. Whether the developers shouldn't necessarily be the people who are writing the automated tests, however, because they are not, unless they are also testers, if they have that role as well and have those skills, the testing that they do may be more related to positive testing rather than negative testing, for example, whereas testers would be able to bring more negative tests into it. But they, as you say, they may well have an idea of where the weakest areas would be, so they could, if they were able to, bring ideas for what the testing should focus on, knowing something about that that perhaps the testers wouldn't be aware of. By the way, another thing in terms of the roles in who's going to be developing the automation, a lot of people say, well, let's just let the testers do the automation. But of course, if they don't have the development skills in order to structure it well, that's where you often end up having problems with maintenance. Hans Buwalda, another excellent test automation expert, he says if you let the testers do the automation, you may lose a good tester and gain a poor programmer. Okay, any other questions? We have time for a couple more. All right. There's a question about what could be lost in automation. I mentioned that as one of the other things to cover. There are some things that you could lose in automation. You might well lose awareness of the big picture, of the overall picture of the application. Manual testers often have a very good view of the big picture. Developers tend to be focused more on narrower things, and test automators tend to be focused on narrower things as well. You may have less awareness of what's been going on in testing as a whole, and less awareness of perhaps bugs that aren't covered by scripts, so unexpected things. Less awareness of, also another thing that might be lost in automation is a user perspective. If you're testing from a technical point of view through the API, for example, and not testing through the GUI, you may be missing off things that are important for the user's experience, but you haven't found them in your automation. Of course, testing through the GUI has problems of its own as well. And variety, the automation may well be doing the same thing every time, but variety can be good. And flexibility, adapting to change. So there are some things that get lost with automation. So any other questions? I don't see any others, so does that mean that we're finished?
I think it does. Well, thank you very much, Dorothy. It's an excellent webinar. And just to mention again, the workshop that we mentioned at the beginning on test automation is on the 26th of June in London, and the website for that is unicom.co.uk. You'll see the workshops and also the Next Generation Testing Conference the day before that Dorothy is presenting at, also listed on the site. To mention also that we will be making a recording available of the webinar afterwards. We'll be in touch with a link for that if you'd like to share it with your colleagues, and hope that we will see you, or some of you, at the conference and workshop later in a month. So thank you very much indeed. Goodbye.
Thank you.